Oh, pardon me. Sorry, I was just playing my Pokemon Go. I have no idea what the crave is about this Pokemon Go. I don't get it. But anyways, if you're having a wonderful time playing this game and having a great time exercising, good on you. So hey guys, welcome back to another Monday Critique. I hope you guys are having a fantastic Monday. I'm having a wonderful Monday. We have two fantastic images to critique today, and I can't wait to jump straight into it. So after this intro, we'll get into it. If you guys want to submit your image to be critiqued, please join our Facebook group. It's called Fine Art Photography and Modeling. In that group, I created a specific thread where you could submit your images to be critiqued. All right, guys, welcome back. So let's jump straight into this first image. This image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much, King, for submitting your image. I sincerely appreciate it. So now let's jump straight into it. So the very first thing I always start out with is light. So in this particular image, King basically used an octabox on camera right to help balance the artificial light with the natural light. So he did a wonderful job with balancing those two light sources. So with respect to this image, there's a couple of things that I think you did really, really well with respect to the lighting. And there's just a couple of small things with respect to the lighting that we can enhance just a little bit better with respect to this subject. So when I'm working with Caucasian subjects, the issue that I generally run into is tanning, right? So basically sometimes what happens is the face of the subject is well tanned, and then the area of the skin that generally doesn't get exposed to the sun that often, probably because they are covered for the most part, and that area of the subject doesn't get exposed. So in this particular image, the subject here, her chest, I'm assuming, doesn't get exposed that much to the sun. So it's not as tan as her face. So you have these two different levels of light and darkness, right? So basically her face is a little bit darker and her skin is a little bit lighter. So what happens is when you're using an artificial light or any light source really to help light the subject, what tends to happen is obviously we would expose for the subject's face, right? So if we're exposing for the subject's face, the face will be properly exposed. But what happens is if that light happens to capture or hit that area of the skin that's a little bit lighter than the face, well, that area of the skin becomes a little bit overexposed. So what you tend to have to do is go back in post and try to balance that exposure in post. However, what I try to do or tend to do is if I notice that I'm going to be dealing with that type of situation where the skin is going to be overexposed and I notice that there's a difference in the light and darkness with respect to the subject, I tend to turn the area of the subject, in this case with respect to this subject, her chest, I would have turned her chest away from that light source so that the light doesn't hit her chest, because we're not exposing for the chest, we are exposing for the face. So when the light hit the subject, the face will be properly exposed, and that area of the subject that is lighter than her face will not be overexposed. So you won't have that problem where you have that overexposure issue on the chest. But like I said, it can be easily fixed in post, but if you wanted to fix it in camera, that's one way of fixing it, which is basically turning the body away from that light source, and that would help with that overexposure issue that I see in this image with respect to your subject. So that's it. That's generally all I have to say about the light. And I mean, in the background, you have a little bit of a light distraction going on in the background, but to me, it's not that distracting. I think it's fine. So from a lighting perspective, I think you did a really, really, really great job in balancing the artificial light with the natural light. So with that said, we'll move on to the next section. All right, guys, so now let's move on to the posing in this image. So from a posing perspective, Overall, I think you guys did an awesome job with the posing. Both you and your subject did a wonderful job with the posing. The fingers are nice and soft. You guys created a nice little triangle there with the arm. I mean, the expression on the face is great. I just love everything about this pose. So there's really nothing I could say with respect to the pose to adjust it. So with that said, I would just move on. All right, guys, so now let's move on to the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, overall, I think you did an awesome job with the composition in this image. However, there is one area in this image, which if you look to camera right, that little area in the back there where you have the little bit of a light leak, if we could have hid that with our composition, I think that would have helped us focus a little bit more on the subject. But that's just a minor issue. I think for the most part, I think your composition is fine. And I don't think there's much I could tell you to adjust with respect to your composition to help enhance this image anymore. So overall, I think you guys did an awesome job. So with that said, I'll just leave the composition and move on. All right, guys, so now let's move on to the post-production in this image. So I have my computer here. So now let's move on to what I did with respect to the post-production, because I believe by showing you guys what I was thinking is probably better than me just talking about it with respect to this particular image. So let's just jump straight into it, okay? So this is the image creator's final image, okay? This is what he submitted to me, okay? And let me just adjust this just a little bit so that you guys can get the full picture, okay? So this is his submission. Now, this is what I did to it. So what I did to it is I just basically made the image a little bit warmer. I felt that gave the image just a little bit more life. Again, this is just my interpretation, okay? So that's all I did to the image. Also, if you notice in the top right-hand corner of the image, I also adjusted, I'm not sure what that was, but it just seems to be a slight discoloration, like the sky. Maybe that was a piece of cloud or something, but there was just some slight discoloration there. So I kind of adjusted that. And I also enhanced the color on this particular area here, which is the leaves. I enhanced it to more of like a, you know, fall type colors. I kind of like that better. So that's what I did there. Also, if you notice, the other thing that I did was really quickly. Now you could spend some time to really enhance this and make this better. But if you notice that there is a slight discoloration on the subject's skin, like there's some lighter areas and some darker areas. So when you're doing retouching, you try to balance so it can be one seamless color and it's not as distracting, okay? So let's jump into the very first thing that I did, which was try to correct the color issue on her skin, right? The light areas, the dark areas, try to make it all one, okay? So as opposed to just working with curves, and I didn't want to spend too much time doing this, so I basically said, let me just go into exposure 6 and basically try to see what I can do in exposure 6 with those presets that they have in there to help blend the color. So basically I got one of the filters. I pretty much forgot which filter it was, but if you go into exposure 6, there's plenty of filters that you play around with. You just pick one that works for you and you know you're happy with. Okay, so I just particularly picked one. This one just helped to blend those colors just a little bit better. Now I did reduce the opacity on this filter so that it doesn't, you know, impact the image that much. So I dropped it by almost 50%. I also dropped the filter in exposure 6 by about 50% as well, right? Because I didn't want to influence the image that much. So I did reduce that exposure. So this helped just, you know, give that image a little bit more warmth, you know, what I was looking for. And it also helped, you know, blend those colors on the subject a little bit better. Okay, I'm not really sure how this is being translated on the video, but right here on my screen, it, you know, it warms up the image just a little bit and blends those colors. So that's the first thing I did there. All right, so the next thing I did was try to work on dodging and burning and adding some light into this image. So let's look at that really quickly. Okay, so if I turn this on, you could see the effect that I did. I mean, it's very, very, very light, but it's there. I'm not really sure how it's translated on the video, but it's all I did. So let's open this up. So this is my dodge layer. All I did was basically, actually this is not dodge, it was burning. So let's rechange that really quickly. This is burn, okay? So all I'm doing is adding, and let me show you exactly where I painted. So if you see over here, here, and our arms, a little bit on our chest area, I basically try to add some darkness in that area so it can add a little bit more depth and dimension to this image. So that's all I did there with respect to the dodging and burning. So all I did was burning, not really dodging. All I did was just burning, just try to see if I could give this image a little bit more depth and dimension. And all I used was a mouse, probably not the best thing to use, but I was trying to be quick with it. So that's all I did there. I'm using a curve, okay? The next thing is on her face. I try to add a little bit of light on her face. So if we turn this layer on, so all I did here was basically reduce the exposure around the subject. I don't want that effect to impact the subject's face. So all I did was basically exclude the subject's face. As you can see here, that's all I did. I excluded the face from this effect. So the exposure on the subject's face is exactly the same as it was when we initially started, because this effect is not impacting that particular area, which is the subject's face, okay? So that's all I did there. So if I take that off, and let me show you before and after, okay? So all it's doing is reducing the exposure around the subject and leaving the subject's face the same. So next thing here is some color work that we did to the image. So if we turn this on, okay, so let's take a look at each one of these layers and let's see what is it that I did to each one, okay? So the first thing, this hue saturation layer. So on the hue saturation layer, all I did in the background, as you could see, if you look here, increase my mouse so you can see. So if you look back here, right, all I did was isolated the yellows and I basically increased the saturation. So if I open up this hue saturation layer, go to the yellows, as you can see, I change my hue to about -16, and then I increase the saturation on that area. So if I do it before, after, before, after. And another thing that I did was also isolated the subject. So if you see anywhere it's red, that's where the effect is not being impacted. So the subject is not being impacted by this effect, okay? Because I wanted to take the effect off of the subject. I only wanted to impact this area in the background, okay? All right, so let's go on to the next layer. Actually, this layer, I'm not really sure why I still have this layer. I think I was trying to do some color work on this layer, but I think this layer ended up doing nothing. So basically, we ignore this layer because this layer is not really doing much to the image. So let's get rid of that. Okay, so this layer here, this layer basically added some blues to the shadow area of this image. So the way I did that, if I open up the layers, okay, if I went to the blues, all I did was push this shadow side of the levels, and I pushed some blues into the shadow area of this image, okay? All right, so now let's move on to the next layer. So the next layer, what I did here was basically try to reduce the contrast in the image. So that's all this layer is doing. So if you expose that a little bit, all I did here is if you look at the shadow area, I pushed that in. And if you look at the light areas, I pushed that in. So that's all I did there to reduce the contrast in this image. And the reason I did that was because if I add a gradient, which is the next one that we're gonna look at, it adds a little bit too much contrast to the image. So by reducing the contrast, just basically helps when that gradient is added so that the image don't appear to be too contrasty, okay? So the next thing I did here was add this gradient layer, and all this gradient layer is basically at the bottom of the image, is making the bottom of the image a little bit darker and is not impacting the top part of the image. That's all the gradient is doing, okay? So that's all that gradient is doing. And that is all the effects that I did as far as the color on this image. So if you look at the before, and then this is the after, before, after. So that's all the work that I did with respect to the color. So then the last thing I did was in this particular area here at the top, I just found that to be a little bit distracting. So I kind of basically used the use the clone stamp tool to basically get rid of that little line there and make the image a little bit more focused on the subject and less distracting. So those are all the things that I did with this image from a post-production perspective. And I think if you focus on just those little things, I mean, these are not major things that I did. If you just focus on just those little things, it would help with enhancing your image just a little bit more. All right, guys, so now let's move on to image number 2. So this image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much, Carlos, for submitting your image. Let's jump straight into it. So let's start out with lighting. So from a lighting perspective, what we're trying to go for here, what I think Carlos was trying to go for here was a moody, very dramatic image. And I think for the most part, you're almost there. And let's take a look at what you did, or what I think you did, by analyzing this image just a little bit more. So the first thing, let's analyze the two light sources that's coming from camera left and camera right. So those two light sources that's hitting the subject here, okay? So what I try to do is I try to make sure that I work with one light source to begin with, right? And then I start building on top of that. Maybe I'll do a video on that one day. But I try to work with one light source and then build on top of that light source. So I try to figure out what my main light is going to be. And then from there, I start adding additional light sources to help enhance the image, or to help with getting the image to that end result that's, you know, in my mind, at least what I think is in my mind at the time, to help me create the image that I'm going for. So you always start out with one main light source. So when I look at your image, I don't even know where that light source is coming from. That's why I wanted to start with the two light sources that's on the left and right, okay? So those two light sources that's on the left and right, I'm assuming those two light sources is to help try to separate the subject from the background. Now, the challenge that I have with those two light sources is that is not really doing that, right? Right now is a little bit distracting, it's a little bit too harsh. So right now, the light that's on camera right, the challenge that I always have myself is trying to also, trying to make sure that that light that's on the right, that's just supposed to separate the subject from the background, is try to make sure that light doesn't hit the subject's cheek, right? That's a challenge that I always have. And I think one of the things that I try to do there is to put like a snoot or a grid to help concentrate that light a little bit more so it doesn't spill onto the subject's cheek. The fact that it's spilling onto the subject's cheek, it just makes it a little bit distracting, because now you have this shadow, a weird shadow in the subject's face that is just not flattering. So one of the things you got to do there is put a grid or put a snoot on that light so that that light just hits the back of the subject's head, for a hair light, or if it's for the shoulder, just to hit the shoulder a little bit. So that's what I would have done with that light source, which was to camera right. All right, so now let's talk about that light source on camera left. So that light source in camera left, I'm assuming that light source is also another light source to help separate the subject from the background. That's my assumption. The only reason I say that is because it seems to be a narrow strip of light that's just hitting the right side of the subject's face, right? So, but I believe the intent of that light perhaps was supposed to be like the main light source for the subject. So that's the assumption that I'm gonna go with, that you were trying to utilize that light on camera left as your main light source. So with that assumption in mind, what I would suggest here was, instead of a strip box, which is, if that's what you had on camera left, I would have used a grid. I would have get like a small light source and put a grid on that light, so that that light could be concentrated and hit the subject's face, and it would have created a nice circular light on the subject's face and casting a nice little shadow on the camera right side of the subject's face. So that's what I would have done there, and then you wouldn't have any light spillage, and it would have still give you that dramatic portrait that you were going for in this image, but it won't give you that light spillage, and you won't have that narrow strip of light that's on the subject's right side of the face. So when you're looking at the subject's face in this image, so when I'm looking at the subject's face, the light balance is just not there. So I think if you make those slight adjustments that I talked about, with the light source coming from camera left and the right, and the light source coming from camera right, so I think with just those two adjustments that I talked about would have helped fix the issues with the subject's face as far as the light is concerned, and it would also help with separating your subject from the background. So those are the two things I would have done there with respect to the light for her face. Now let's move on to some other areas. So now moving on to the body, right? So as far as the body is concerned and the light that's hitting her body, I don't mind the light, how it's hitting her body right now. To me, it helps sell the drama of this image, and to me that's totally fine. So now let's move on to the light that's hitting the water, right? And the light that's hitting the surrounding areas. On the water, you have this yellow light, and I think in post-production you could have probably removed that little distraction. The reason I say it's a little bit distracting is because it doesn't go well with the image, right? Now, usually yellow and blue goes nicely together as far as color contrast, but with this image, this is like a deep yellow, and it's just a little bit too distracting. So what I would have suggested, and I think that's probably coming from not a light that you created, but it's probably coming from the ambient light that's within the area wherever you're shooting. So what I would have said here is, basically in post, maybe you can get rid of it because of your composition or whatever, but in post I would have said just get rid of that light source because it's just a little bit distracting in this image. So now let's talk about the light that's hitting the surrounding areas like the tub and whatnot. For me, I think those light sources are pretty well placed, right? It gives just a hint of detail as to where the subject is, and it helps sells that drama. And I think you did a wonderful job with your exposure by hiding all the other mess I'm sure that's around the tub. I think you did a pretty good job by hiding all of that by using a great exposure to help eliminate that. So overall, I think if you make those slight adjustments with respect to your lighting, I think this image would be just a little bit better. But great job with the lighting. Alright guys, so now let's move on to the posing in this image. So from a posing perspective, here's a couple of things that I want to talk about to help enhance this image just a little bit. So let's start from the top down, right? So first thing, let's start with our head. So if I'm going to tell a person to adjust their head by turning it this way, up this way, all of those movements is to help with the lighting on the subject's face. And I also try to make sure that it's flattering, as well, as far as from a posing perspective, because if a person have their face awkwardly positioned, well, when you take that image, it's going to look awkward. So with respect to this person and her face and her head, how it's positioned is just positioned just a little bit awkwardly. It doesn't help with the lighting, and it makes her head just appears to be a little bit out of place, right? So what I would have done here is, assuming we had the lighting proper, I would adjust her head to be properly positioned to that light. Preferably, I would have liked to see her head just come back to camera just a little bit more, as opposed to how it is right now. It's turned just a little bit too far away from the camera, and it's just not helping with the lighting or the posing. So That's all I have to say about that with respect to head. Just bring it back just a little bit to the camera, and as far as your light, just position the light a little bit more, like maybe over your shoulder, so it could hit the subject's face a little bit better, and she'll be able to be looking at the camera just a little bit more, and it wouldn't appear to be so awkward. So that's all I have to say with respect to the head. Let's move on to other areas. So now let's move on to another area, which is the top part of her body, more specifically her right hand. So if you look at her right hand, you will see that her right hand is just a little bit awkwardly positioned as well. Now it appears like she's trying to grab her chest, and I know that's not what she's doing, but that's what it appears to be. So when I'm taking an image, you have to basically pay attention to all these little things before you take that shot. If you're taking test shots and whatnot, that's all well and good. But when you're ready to rock and roll and you're ready to take that image, you have to look at these little fine details to ensure that something is not distracting you away from your overall vision, right? So if a viewer is looking at this image, you don't want that little item, that little thing to be, saying, hey, that's a little bit too distracting, and people will concentrate on that. So just pay attention to those little details. I know hands are a little bit tough when it comes to posing and whatnot, but you know what? You have to do what feels comfortable sometimes. So when you're playing with, trying to adjust these little fine details, play with the hands and just, figure out what feels comfortable. Look at it. If the model says, look, this just feels uncomfortable, sometimes that uncomfortable feeling is a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. So you just have to judge it. You have to look at it and figure out what makes for a good. So if you look at our hands, you can just tell by looking at it that the hand just appears to be a little bit awkwardly positioned. So I would just adjust that. And once you adjust that, that will make the image so much better. All right, guys, so now let's move on to the lower part of the subject, which is her leg specifically. So here's the thing that I would suggest with her leg. Right now, her right leg is down, right? So here's my suggestion. The leg closest to the camera, always have that leg up, okay? I will explain why, if you ever meet me in person, why I would ever want that leg to be up. I don't think it's probably appropriate for video, but you want that right leg to be up. When you're photographing a subject and the leg that's closest to the camera, you always want that leg to be up and the other leg to be down, okay? So just keep that as a rule of thumb. I won't get into any more details about it here. It's when you meet me in person, I'll let you know more. But that's all I would say about that. I think if you make that adjustment, that would help to make this image a little bit more elegant and a little bit more flattering, okay? So that's all I have to say about that before I get into any more trouble. So let's move on to the next thing. All right, so now let's get into the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, overall the composition is fine. So here's a couple of things I would suggest to enhance it just a little bit. First thing, if you look at the top portion of the image, you will notice that as far as the composition is concerned, is very much so cropped in at the top of her head, okay? Now, I would say give your subject a little bit more headroom, okay? Just a little bit, not too much, just a little bit. Now, you don't need all that room at the bottom that you have there. And the reason I say the bottom part of your image, that is, and the reason I say that is because of that yellow light that I talked about earlier before under the lighting section. I think you could eliminate that by just adjusting your composition just a little bit, just to eliminate. So if you come up a little bit more with your composition, it would eliminate that yellow light. So that's all I would say with respect to your composition. Overall, everything else with respect to your composition, I think is fine. So I would just simply move on from here. All right, so now moving on to the post-production in this image. So from a post-production perspective, okay, so we have a dramatic, moody image going on here, okay? We don't have much details going on in the background. So we have to work with what we got, okay? So with respect to this image, the first thing I would do with respect to the post-production is eliminate that yellow light immediately. That yellow light needs to go. That's what I would do immediately. I would get rid of that. The other thing I would do is try to add just a little bit more details in the shadow area. Just a little bit. You don't want too much, just a little bit detail in the shadow area. So now let's move on to the subject's head, specifically her hair, okay? So if you notice on the subject's right side, which I guess is camera left, you will notice right next to her eyes, you will notice that there's a couple of little bit of wild hair just coming out there. I would say in post, eliminate those immediately. So the last thing I'm going to talk about with respect to the post-production and the subject's face is if you can. Now, I don't generally recommend this because I try to get it right in camera, right? When you're talking about getting stuff right in camera, like this is what you would need to get right in camera to begin with, right? So the lighting, right? So right now the lighting on our face is just not that great. So what I would try to do is, if this was an image that you absolutely needed to save because you needed to produce it and give it to the client, I would say focus on trying to fix the light on her face. Now, there's not much you could do with respect to the post-production, but there is some things that you could try to do. So you could try to eliminate that light that's on her cheek, you know, to make that one shadow as opposed to having that shadow that's in the middle of her face. I would try to eliminate that light, okay, and just make it one shadow, that so you can have a little bit more depth and dimension in the image. In addition to that, I would also try to concentrate the light, try to give it some light direction on her face so that you still have that shadow area that's on her left side of her face. But if you look on the right side of her face, I would try to make sure that light is a little bit more even on her right side of her face in post. I would have done it here, but it's going to take me way too long to fix the lighting on her face. So that's why a lot of photographers say, you know, to get it right in camera, because when you get it right in camera, you don't have to spend hours in post-production to fix lighting. Because if you get your lighting right in camera, the only thing you have to do is basically focus on enhancing the image. So that's all I have to say with respect to the post-production. But overall, man, I think you did a great job in trying to execute a dramatic image, and I think for the most part you're there. I just don't think that the lighting that you had for, you know, the side and the right side of the image and the left side of the image, I think those are the two light sources that basically didn't come together in this image. So like I said, if you just focus on one light source to begin with, when you're starting out any portrait, doesn't matter whatever portrait it is, just focus on one light source first. It could be natural light, it could be an artificial light, doesn't matter. You just have to focus on one light source first, and that light source is primarily your main light. And then once you have your main light dialed in and you're happy with it, then you start adding more and more lights. All right, so overall, like I said, good job, man. I think you are almost there. And if you were to go and execute this image again, please let me know and let me see it, because I would love to. All right, so great job. Thank you very much. All right, guys, now let's move on to the rating of these two images. Light, I gave this image a 4. Pose, I gave this image a 5. Composition, I gave this image a 4. Post-production, I gave this image a 3. Overall, I gave this image a 4 out of 5. All right, guys, now let's move on to image number 2. Light, I gave this image a 1. Pose, I gave this image a 2. Composition, I gave this image a 3. Post-production, I gave this image a 2. Overall, this image received a rating of 2 out of 5. All right, guys, thank you very much for submitting your image. I sincerely appreciate it. I hope you guys got a lot of value out of what I had to say today. I hope it was helpful to you. I hope it was helpful to the viewers of this video. Guys, if you have any other suggestion in addition to what I already said, please put those comments down below, because it would help not only me, but it would also help the image creators. So thank you very much for doing that. That is it. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with your friends and family. And please put some feedback down below and let me know what you think about this video. And guys, if you got this far in the video, you must be enjoying this content and you must be enjoying this channel. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next Monday.